Good morning, everyone. Can I be heard in the back easily? Great. Well, I'm here to talk about the election and what happened and what does it mean. And I thought I should begin by just bringing my PhD in and ripping it up. Because so much of what we thought we knew about politics has gone away over the last few years. Perhaps starting here in Virginia a couple of years ago, when Dave Bratt defeated Eric Cantor for Congress. I remember that Dave was actually is a personal friend of mine, that we served on a nonprofit board together, and I went around the stage saying he had no chance of winning. He still talks to me now and then on that front. So again, another election that surprised the polls and the pundits. And what I want to do really today are 3 or 4 things. First, I want to talk briefly about the national election and what happened there. Secondly, I want to talk about why Virginia didn't go the way of the nation, why Virginia had results that were very different than the nation, and particularly all other southern states. Thirdly, talk a little bit about 2017 and the upcoming elections in Virginia. And finally, fourth, try to talk about how we ought to sort of focus our attentions over the next year as well. So let me just begin nationally in trying to make some sense out of the election. People in my business often look at a number of factors. So the first factor we always look at is how well was the incumbent perceived by the public? What was the opinion of Barack Obama by the public? And what we found during the election is that he actually had a pretty high approval rating. His approval rating, in fact, went up as people began to see more of the candidates in this election. Went up to about 55%. But what we saw is that it's difficult for any individual to translate their popularity to someone else, in this instance Hillary Clinton, and it's also difficult for a president's party that's running for a third term, you might say, to win as well. That hasn't been done all that often in recent years. Secondly, we often look at the overall state of the economy. And what we saw today earlier tells us a lot of how the public was seeing this. That on one hand, if you look at some of that data, it looks like the economy's gotten a lot better. If you saw that data in 2008 to 2016, unemployment is halved. If you looked at the stock market's more than doubled. So that with the level of unemployment, the level of wealth that was being created in the country, you would have thought that would have served the incumbent party well. But what we've noted, both nationally and here in Virginia, is that there's been an underside to that economy. And that underside really had to do with the frustration that many families were feeling about their own personal situation and family wages. And you saw that data before about family income being relatively stagnant, in some instances not for 8 years, but for 15 years or for 20 years. As the economy's been transformed, you saw a lot of frustration there. Certainly Donald Trump tapped that, and on the Democratic side, we have to remember that Bernie Sanders tapped that as well. Both of those folks, in very different ways, had a very similar message. The system was rigged against ordinary folks, and that system that they were talking about was the economic system that weren't allowing a lot of people to sort of progress in terms of their income. And so that, I think, was an underlying dimension that was as important as some of those data that showed the economy improving significantly. Some of the results that we saw with a huge distinction in terms of voting behavior between people who were in the old economy and the new economy. Regions that were leading in the new economy were primarily Clinton. Old economy folks were primarily Trump. And we saw that during this. Thirdly, what we also saw when we looked at sort of the context of the election was some data about what people thought of the direction of the country. And consistently throughout the last year, we've seen 65% of the public saying they thought the country was on the wrong track, that the direction of the country was askew in some significant way. And what was fascinating about that is that was the 45% of the people who didn't like Barack Obama, plus 20% more. Now, what were they upset at? Some of it might have been terrorism. Some of it might have been economic stagnation. A lot of it, I think, was this sense that just in general that Washington didn't work at all. I saw a poll last week that had an approval rating of Congress at 11%. Now that's pretty shocking to everybody, right? You didn't know they had that many friends and relatives there. But overall, but that helps a little bit to explain Donald Trump's success in the Republican Party. He ran against 16 other Republicans, all of whom, all 17, disliked the Democrats and Barack Obama. But there was one of the 17 that made a distinction because he disliked all of the rest as well. He disliked the establishment. He ran against them as well as he had a distinctive message inside the Republican Party, and running against 16 people, many of whom didn't take him seriously, many of them who thought that he would certainly falter down the road, he was able to achieve what they weren't able to achieve. And then finally, we often look at what people think of the candidates themselves, and what we saw is that by the end of this race, these two candidates had the lowest approval ratings of any two candidates since we have started polling 70 years ago. Right? Donald Trump's on election night, 35% of the people who voted thought he had the temperament to be president, and 37% thought he was qualified to be president, and he got 47% of the vote. But part of that was because during the campaign, Hillary Clinton's negatives had gone up and up and up and up as well. So at the end of the day, Republicans came home because they didn't see this clear distinction between Trump and Clinton. They had problems with each of them in that sense. And certainly, people began to say, I'll take a chance on change rather than the status quo. And if we look at the vote per se, what happened at the end of the day that had the pollsters all aflutter, I think, was this. That if you take a look at the national polls, they turn out to be not that far off. The national polls were about 3% to 4%. Hillary Clinton's going to win the popular vote by about 1.5% to 2%. Where they were deadly wrong were state by state, where they got so many of the battleground states wrong. And what happened there, and there's lots of discussion and argument, but my way of putting it simplistically is this, that on one hand, Donald Trump turned out rural voters in larger numbers than expected, and he was able to switch some working class voters over, perhaps who voted for Obama, over to Trump, and at the same time he managed to maintain the vast majority of Republicans voted for him. That there wasn't the crossover that Hillary Clinton was expecting on that front. Hillary Clinton, on her side, did not turn out and reassemble the Obama coalition in the same turnout numbers that she expected. Young people didn't come out either in the same numbers or in the same force for Clinton, and a number of ethnic minorities, African Americans, Latinos, did not come out, particularly in some key places. So one example of that was really paradigm, I think, was Wisconsin, where Hillary Clinton didn't go there from April 19th on, thought she had it won. And if you look at the Wisconsin vote, Donald Trump got the same exact vote that Mitt Romney did in 2012, about 1.4 million votes. But Barack Obama got 1.6 million, and Hillary Clinton was at 1.388 million. That she wound up losing 200,000 votes, either for people who didn't turn out in some of the urban areas, or maybe people who went to the third party. But what happens in every poll is that the pollsters ultimately make some kind of implicit model of who's going to show up in the election. And that's what they had wrong. They had it wrong on both sides. They underestimated the rural vote and the working class vote for Trump, and they overestimated the minority vote, particularly in the urban vote, for Hillary Clinton. And what happened is that in those Rust Belt states, that economic populist message, Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, that turned out to be decisive for Donald Trump. Now, turning to Virginia, it didn't quite happen in Virginia. Why not? what happened in Virginia that allowed Hillary Clinton to not only beat Donald Trump handily here, but to do so by a slightly larger margin than Barack Obama won in 2012. Well, first, if you look at rural Virginia, the same thing happened that happened nationally. That went totally red. A few weeks before the election, I was giving a talk up at the Homestead, and I remember on the drive from Stanton to Hot Springs, I did not see a Hillary Clinton sign. All I saw were Trump, Pence, and lock her up. And somebody this morning told me they saw a Clinton sign on there, and it wasn't in Cree Deeds' backyard, front yard. And they said that sign, though, was Hillary for prison. But essentially, rural Virginia went completely that way. And, but what occurred is that in the metropolitan areas of Virginia, the highly populated areas, Hillary Clinton ran extraordinarily strong. Chesterfield County, that used to be the highest vote for Republicans, had a 4,000 vote margin for Trump only. And if you go up to northern Virginia, here are the numbers. Arlington, Alexandria, Fairfax, Prince William, and Loudoun gave a 360,000 vote margin for Hillary Clinton. You know, I told people that, you know, talking about draining the swamp is not the argument that works in Northern Virginia on that front there. But that tells us something that I want to get at, which is something that we sometimes don't quite, we know, but we don't quite specify, which is the dramatic change in Virginia political alliances and political allegiances by region over the last 20 years. If you look back at the 1996 presidential election, 20 years ago, when Hillary Clinton's spouse, Bill Clinton, ran, and you look at Southwest Virginia, Bill Clinton won Buchanan County by over 65%, won Dickinson County by over 60%, and won Tazewell by about 55%. Donald Trump won all three of those counties by over 75% 20 years later. So one change that we've seen in Virginia is that rural Virginia has gone from a place that was half Democratic, half Republican, competitive both ways, to one that is entirely red, with the exception of counties like Brunswick, where you have significant African American populations. But overall, rural Virginia is now completely red. I might add that you could even redistrict that in 20 different ways. It's Republican in that sense. That's where it is. Urban Virginia has stayed the same. It's Democratic. The cities were Democratic 20 years ago. They're still Democratic. However, the metropolitan areas in Virginia have shifted dramatically. The suburban areas. In 1996, Bob Dole carried Fairfax County by 6,000 votes. In 2016, Hillary Clinton carried it by 178,000 votes. It's about 185,000 vote change in 20 years there. Henrico County in 1996 gave Bob Dole his second highest margin in absolute votes of any county in Virginia. In 2016, Henrico County, Hillary Clinton carried it by 33,000 votes. So what you've seen is that the demographic and economic changes in Virginia have changed that suburban vote, and that's the challenge that Republicans face. I asked this question of a lot of groups in the past couple of weeks. I said, name me the 3 jurisdictions in Virginia where Republicans got their largest margin of votes in 2016. I don't know if anyone wants to guess what they are. They are Bedford, Hanover, and Augusta. That's where, and they got about a total of 60,000 vote margin there. That was simply erased by what happened in Arlington in that front. So that's sort of the dramatic change that we've had in Virginia. That if you look over 20 years, rural areas have shifted, Urban areas, urban cities the same. Suburban areas, much more competitive. When you get into state races, what you see is that has held as well, but not by the same margins. And so what's happening as you look forward in the states, what Republicans have to do to win is they have to cut down that margin in Northern Virginia. And in a state race, an off-year election, maybe you only get 55% of the same number of voters that you do in a presidential race. So what's happened is that Republicans have come close a couple of times. Ed Gillespie came very close in 2014. Ken Cuccinelli actually was relatively close in 2013. But they lost those 5 northern jurisdictions, Cuccinelli by about 135,000, Gillespie by 106,000. So the magic number for Republicans up there is somewhere between 90 and 100,000. If they can cut that margin, they could potentially beat the Democrats. But what's happened is that in 9 of the last 10 times we've had a statewide race, and what I mean by that, governor, Senate, president, the Democrats have won because of the changing demographics that we've had in Virginia and the fact that Republicans have been defeated in some of these metro areas. Just a couple of other incidents there. Virginia Beach used to be one of the counties that gave Republicans very large margins. I think Trump won it by about 5,000 to 6,000 votes. Chesterfield County used to be the county that gave Republicans their largest margin of any county in the state, and Trump won that by less than 4,000 votes the other night. So that's what we have in Virginia. We have this dramatic change that has made us, I think, a very competitive state, perhaps a blue state in presidential elections, but in off-year elections, we're a purple state that any group can win. Now, moving forward to 2017 elections, we have the entire general House of Delegates up for election. It's going to remain a heavily Republican body. That Republicans do extremely well in these localized elections in Virginia because if you take a look at the landmass and the like, very much of that still is all red, and the Democrats barely exist in rural Virginia. That's one of their challenges. If I asked you to name me a General Assembly member who is a rural Democrat, who would you name? That's it. Rosalind Tyler is the one who is from rural Virginia and represents rural Virginia. There are other Democrats who represent part of rural Virginia. Creebede's from Bath County, but he also represents part of Albemarle. Linwood Lewis, Eastern Shore, part of Norfolk. But so that's one of the Democrats' issues, is they don't even exist in many ways in rural Virginia right now, electorally, to be successful. So as we go to 2017, I expect the House to remain where it is unless the Supreme Court makes a redistricting decision that could change things, where I still think the Republicans would be the majority, but they wouldn't have as significant a majority. Then we go in the gubernatorial election. Ralph Northam, who you saw lieutenant governor, he'll be anointed by the Democrats. He'll have no opposition. Northam, to me, is the epitome of a great Democratic candidate maybe 15 years ago, in some ways, that he's going to have to put together a different coalition. If you look at him, his pedigree is fabulous. VMI, pediatric neurologist, somebody who can work across the aisle, extremely bright, very smart, great guy. In the new kind of polarized politics we have, will he be able to have crossover appeal? He should, if you take a look at him individually, but whether that's the case in the way politics operates today may not be. And you saw that in 2014 when Mark Warner, who had an approval rating of 65%, simply held on by his fingernails against Ed Gillespie, because it wasn't about Mark Warner the person, it was about the fact that politics had become more polarized and more partisan. And I spoke to any number of people who told me, I voted for Mark Warner in 2008. I like Mark Warner, but I didn't vote for him in 2014 because I don't like Harry Reid. I don't like the Republicans. And so that's kind of what's happening. All these elections become a little more partisan. The Republicans certainly believe this is their best shot in a long time to take the governorship, and you're seeing that because they have 4 pretty strong candidates thinking about running. Frank Wagner, a senator from Virginia Beach, very well known down in the beach, been very effective down there, should be able to raise money from that region. He needs to sort of, I think, try to find the way to develop a statewide message, but certainly a strong, extremely capable legislator. Rob Whitman, congressman from the Northern Neck. I think Rob's going to have to make a choice down the road whether he wants to run for governor full-time almost, or whether he wants to seek even a better seat because he might be in line for a plum subcommittee in Congress. Another strong person, great guy, very well educated, with one of my PhD students on this front, and a wonderful person. And another person, Frank and Rob, certainly have credentials to be excellent Virginia governors. Third person in the race, obviously, Ed Gillespie. Gave Mark Warner the fight of his life in 2014, lost by less than 20,000 votes to the most popular politician in the state, put together the Republican Party, managed to transcend sort of the business community Tea Party divide, did extraordinarily well, is putting together a first-rate campaign right now. You might have seen all of the policy groups that he's putting together to really talk about Virginia's future. Very serious person, would be a very serious contender for that race. And then finally, you're going to hear as well today from Corey Stewart, chairman of the Board of Supervisors in Prince William County. He likes to say he was Donald Trump before Donald Trump on this front. Raised the whole issue of illegal immigration at a local level, is running against the political establishment in some ways, and believes that message can resonate certainly in a Republican primary here in Virginia. So we're going to have this extraordinary race. The challenge, I think, for the race is to try to keep it focused on Virginia issues, because we're one of only 2 states nationally that has a governor's race next year, New Jersey and Virginia. The national media, who all live in Washington and Virginia and Maryland, they're going to camp out here, and they're going to call this race a referendum on Donald Trump's first year. And that is going to be the challenge both for the candidates, I think, and for everyone else, is to try to see if this race will be anything other than that referendum on Donald Trump, and to try to ensure that we keep it on issues that are important to Virginia. Now, finally, I just want to say, going forward, from what we've heard this morning and what the Chamber has been doing for some time, I think since Barry has come here, the Chamber has been focused on the long-term economic future of Virginia. And that is the critical issue that we face. Because if we look at it, if we go even longer, a longer historical period than we were speaking about in some of the data this morning, for over a 50-year period, Virginia was a state that we just assumed was going to outperform the nation. That if you take a look at how far Virginia has come since 1955, the 60-year period, as a state in every possible way, we have just outperformed the rest of the nation. And we've expected that. We go into recessions late, we come out early, and what we're seeing right now is that's not necessarily the case. And we may well, as Barry noted, there could be a Trump bump, or a bump that has to do with the fact that the Republicans are likely to sort of fund defense spending at a higher level, which should be good for Virginia. It also probably would be good if there's an infrastructure program that would help rebuild America, if that is funded. I think that's going to be a more complicated thing for the Republicans to actually fund in Congress. But at the same time, there's some things that we have to be a little wary of. And Barry mentioned that before. Virginia is a state that heavily depends on trade. We talk about the port. Every governor, regardless of party, talks about the port. Every governor is talking about workforce development. But we depend on being significant players in that global economy, and we want to make sure that that continues even under a Trump administration there. I was speaking the other day to farmers, all of whom, perhaps 85% of the folks supported Donald Trump. But they're hoping that, for example, that things like TPP, which would have helped Virginia farmers tremendously by reducing tariffs in Southeast Asia, can get renegotiated bilaterally in ways that help Virginia. So we have to keep that going as well. But at the end of the day, my sense is that what we have to do here in Virginia is to find a way to ensure that over the next 30 years, we're a state that can still outperform the national economy. And I think what the Chamber is doing and what some other groups are doing in W-Win and Go Virginia is really trying to ensure that what we have had here in Virginia and what we've come to expect turns out to be what we can have in the future as well. Finally, I would just say, I was looking at that data about, lack of economic growth and the struggling economy, and fortunately, in political punditry, I'm in one business that is in an exponential growth phase. There. Thanks very much. It was great to be with you.